Hospitals are places where lives initially and often end. But what happens when lost souls fail to find their final rest? In this video, you will hear 5 terrifying stories of workers who faced the unexplainable within the icy halls of hospitals and morgues in the United States. A lone security guard, a dedicated cleaning lady, an on-call electrician, a medical examiner, and a night shift worker. They all witnessed something that will leave you sleepless. Welcome to the channel where every ride could be your last. Here we tell the darkest and most disturbing stories of drivers and passengers who have faced the unexplainable on the roads. If you like feeling that chill down your spine, subscribe now, hit the bell so you don't miss any chilling stories, and share them with your brave friends. Get ready, because the next race could be yours. He glanced toward the lockers. The metal gleamed in the flashlight light, and the sound grew louder. Clang. One of the body storage compartments began banging repeatedly. James knew something was terribly wrong. He took a step back, his heart beating wildly in his chest. But before he could react, the closet opened on its own with a violent force. A body covered with a white sheet slowly slipped out, falling to the ground with a thud. But what happened next froze James' blood. The body moved. The sheet slid aside, revealing a pale, lifeless face with open eyes, staring straight at James. The corpse twitched as if something inside it was trying to break free. This isn't real," James stammered, trying to take a step back. The body began to crawl towards him, eyes never leaving his, as if it were following him. The air in the morgue turned cold, and James' flashlight began to fail. He stumbled backwards, terror finally taking over his body. Without thinking twice, he turned and ran towards the exit. But as he ran, he heard the sound of the body dragging behind him. Faster and faster. When he finally reached the elevator, James opened the button repeatedly, begging him to make it on time. The sound of the body dragging across the floor was getting closer and closer. When the doors opened, he jumped in and hit the button to go up. The doors closed slowly and the sound stopped. The elevator rose and James fell to his knees, panting and breaking into a cold sweat. He knew he would never forget that night. "I would never go back underground." The next morning, the Seattle hospital cleaner. Martha worked as a housekeeper at Seattle General Hospital for over 10 years. For her, it was a peaceful job. The night shift was lonely, but it allowed her to clean without interruption. She was already used to the empty hallways, the dim lights, and the children of medical equipment that filled the silence. However, there was one wing of the hospital that Martha avoided whenever she could: the morgue. It wasn't so much because of the atmosphere, which in itself was already gloomy, but because of the rumors that circulated among the employees. Some said they had seen things they couldn't explain. Others claimed they heard low voices and crying coming from the morgue, even when it was empty. Martha, being a practical person, always laughed at these boats. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But on the night of November 15th, something happened that made him reconsider. It was around 2 a.m. when Martha was called to clean the morgue. A body had been removed for an autopsy, and she is needed to disinfect the procedure room before the coroner's shift begins. She didn't like the idea but accepted the call. Work was work after all. The morgue was located in the basement of the hospital, in a poorly lit corridor. The lights flickered faintly as she pushed her cleaning cart down the narrow hallway. The sound of his shoes echoed off the walls, creating an even heavier atmosphere. As she reached the door of the autopsy room, she stopped for a moment and took a deep breath. "It's just a room like any other," she told herself, trying to banish any negative thoughts. Upon opening the door, the room felt cold, more than normal. The air smelled sterile, mixed with something metallic. Martha turned on the light and began cleaning, mopping the stainless steel surfaces and disinfecting the floor. The only sound he could hear was the soft rustling of cloth being wrung out and the occasional creaking of metal. Then suddenly the lights flickered. "Great, now we need a light bulb," he muttered, rolling his eyes. She continued her work, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something was watching her. There was no one else there, at least not that she commented on. But for some reason, the silence in that room was suffocating. That's when she heard a noise. It seemed like a transmission, almost imperceptible, coming from behind the curtain that covered the area where the bodies were stored. Martha stopped immediately, her heart beating faster. It must be the wind, he thought. But she knew there were no windows down there. Trying not to let fear take over, she slowly moved through the curtain. The room was colder now and the air felt heavier. She hesitantly held the curtain and took a quick peek. What he saw on the other side made his heart stop. A woman's body, still covered by a white sheet, was lying on the stretcher. So far, everything was normal, as I knew that the coroner had removed the body for an autopsy. But the problem was that the body was not immobile. I was breathing. Martha froze. She knew that was impossible. No one could be breathing in an autopsy room, especially a body that has already been confirmed deceased. But before his eyes, the corpse's chest rose and fell slowly as if it was taking a breath. She stepped back, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I heard inspiration again. This time, clearer, and it comes directly from the body. The voice, soft and distorted, seemed to say something incomprehensible. Martha swallowed hard and, without thinking twice, ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. She ran through the basement hallways, her heart racing. When he finally stopped, he was panting and in a cold sweat. I tried to rationalize what I had just seen. Maybe it was a hallucination, she thought, trying to convince herself. I was tired and the light was flickering. Yes, that should have been it. But just as I was about to return to his cleaning cart, I went to the autopsy room door to open it by myself. The sound echoed through the silent hallway, and a chill ran down his spine. Slowly she turned to look. The door was open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the woman's figure. Still covered by the sheet, but now standing upright. The contours of the body were indistinguishable beneath the white fabric, and the woman moved strangely, almost as if she were floating. Marta? That's the electrician on duty at Chicago Hospital. Derek was an electrician at Chicago Memorial Hospital, a large and busy hospital. He was called in to fix electrical problems that cropped up at any time of the day or night, and Friday night was no different. He received a call that the lights on the morgue floor were flickering and that the emergency generator was not working properly. Derek was used to these calls. He knew that many of the hospital buildings were old and needed constant maintenance. The morgue, in particular, always seemed to have some problem with the lights. But most of the time he faced it as part of the job. Upon arriving at the hospital around midnight, he went directly underground. The morgue was in a separate wing, where there was almost never a time change. The silence was oppressive, but Derek, always practical, was more concerned with solving the problem quickly and getting home. When he entered the generator room, the first thing he noticed was the cold air. Although he was used to refrigerated environments, that cold seemed abnormal. He provided the power board and discovered that the emergency generator was off by itself. The piece looked intact, but something wasn't right. He manually turned on the generator, and as he did so, he heard a low, rhythmic noise coming from the hallway. It was the sound of footsteps, as if someone was slowly walking through the morgue. Derek was surprised, as he knew that floor must be empty. He took his flashlight and was investigated. The hallways were bathed in a dim, yellowish light, and the lights flickered faintly, as if the generator was still struggling to maintain power. As he walked forward, the footsteps became clearer, but there was still no one in sight. "Is anyone there?" Derek called, but the echo was the only response he received. When he reached the main room of the morgue, he saw something that left him paralyzed. In the center of the room, where the stretchers normally were, there was a body covered by a white sheet. But that wasn't what scared him. What froze him in fear was the sound of someone laughing, a soft, distorted laugh that seemed to come from everything at once. Derek stepped back, a tremendous flashlight in his hand. The laughter stopped, but the sound of footsteps continued. They were approaching him from behind. He quickly spun around, but there was no one there. Suddenly the lights went out all at once. The corridor was plunged into total darkness. Derek tried to turn on a flashlight, but it flickered weakly, almost out of battery. The sound of footsteps was closer now, and the laughter, although quieter, echoed again. "No. This can't be happening," Derek muttered, his body frozen with fear. The figure of a woman, covered with a white sheet, was standing at the end of the corridor, motionless. Her bare feet floated a few inches off the ground. The footsteps continued, but her body didn't move. Derek felt his blood freeze in his veins. The flashlight shook in his hand as he tried to control the panic that took over his body. "This can't be real," he murmured, unable to look away from that ghostly presence. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and when they stabilized, the figure disappeared. The hallway was empty. Derek took a deep breath, trying to convince himself that this was just his mind playing tricks, a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But then he heard something that made him doubt his sanity. A voice, low and slurred, whispered his name. "Derek?" The sound seemed to come from all sides, filling the hallway with a paved feel. He turned quickly, lighting the way with his flashlight. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. The sound of the voice continued to call him, getting closer and closer, as if someone was walking directly behind him. "Who's there?" Derek said, trying to hide the fear in his voice. The echo of his question quickly died into silence. Receiving no response, he decided it was time to leave Dolly. Turning around, he began walking quickly towards the elevator. Each step felt more difficult than the last, as if something was pulling him back. The sound of footsteps continued to follow him, now louder, as if someone was running to meet him. When he finally reached the elevator, he opened the button repeatedly, almost begging for the doors to open. The sound of footsteps was getting closer, and he knew he couldn't wait any longer. The elevator doors slowly opened, and Derek entered, hitting the button to go up. The sound of footsteps stopped abruptly as the doors began to close. For a moment, everything was silent. But before the doors closed completely, he again saw the woman's figure standing at the end of the corridor. The night shifter at New York Hospital. Dr. Collins spent long night hours at New York General Hospital. As an on-call doctor, he responds to emergencies of all types, from minor accidents to life-and-death cases. Working at night, he had to contend with the silence and darkness of empty hallways, something he always found a little unsettling. However, there was something particularly strange about that night. It was one of those nights when the hospital seemed even quieter than usual, as if something was lurking, waiting for the right moment to speak. Collins didn't believe in ghost stories, but he knew the hospital had a dark trust. Many patients have passed away over the years, and some staff have spoken of unexplained events occurring in the early hours of the morning. That night started normally. He provided patient charts, made a few quick rounds of the hallways, and settled into the break room. Everything was calm until he received a call from the emergency department. "Dr. Collins, we have an unusual case. A man was brought here, but something is wrong with him." The nurse's voice on the other end of the line sounded hesitant, which caught Collins' attention. He didn't like wanted cases, especially in the middle of the night. Still, he made his way to the emergency room. Upon arrival, he was greeted by a nurse who looked visibly uncomfortable. "What is happening?" said Collins. "The patient, he was found unconscious on the streets. When we got here, we tried to stabilize him, but something strange happened," said the nurse, looking at the patient lying on the stretcher. The man was pale, as if all the blood had been drained from his body. His breathing was ragged, and his eyes were open but empty, as if he wasn't really there. Collins examined the troublesome signs, and everything seemed normal except for the fact that the patient was mumbling something unintelligible. "Did he say anything?" said Collins. "I couldn't understand. He whispers things, but it sounds like another language," replied the nurse, visibly scared. Collins moved and listened intently. The man was muttering words that were a mixture of Latin and something more archaic. The sound was disturbing, almost mesmerizing. He tried to speak to the patient, but the man continued mumbling, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Suddenly, the lights in the emergency room flickered, and the man let out a loud, piercing scream, enough to make everyone in the room flinch. His hand gripped the edge of the stretcher with uncanny strength, and then he sat up, his eyes still empty, looking directly at Collins. "He's possessed," the nurse said, almost breathless. Collins did not believe in possessions or supernatural characteristics, but what he saw that night defied medical explanation. The man began repeating Collins' name, his voice transforming from a low melody to a terrifying scream. Collins tried to remain calm, but fear was evident in his eyes. He asked the team to sedate the man, but every time he tried to get closer, the patient began to struggle violently, as if something was controlling his body. After several minutes of chaos, the patient suddenly fell onto the gurney, motionless. His breathing had stopped and his eyes were slowly closing. Collins moved cautiously and sent the important signals. The man was dead. The hospital recorded the case as a sudden cardiac arrest, but Collins knew that wasn't the whole truth. Something happened in that emergency room, something he could never explain or forget. The Detroit Hospital coroner. Matthews was the chief medical examiner at Detroit Central Hospital, responsible for conducting autopsies on bodies arriving from mysterious or violent cases. He had seen it all over the years, from freak accidents to brutal crimes, and nothing scared him anymore. At least that's what he lost. That afternoon, he received the body of a young woman who had been found dead in inexplicable situations. There were no visible signs of violence, but the look of terror on his face was disturbing. Something caused her death, but Matthews couldn't pinpoint what. He began an autopsy as he did every other time, writing down every detail and looking for any clue that could explain the death. However, something strange happened when he began to examine the young girl's heart. As soon as he touched the organ, he felt a chill run up his arm, as if a negative energy was emanating from his body. For a moment, he felt that his heart was still pulsing lightly. He found out, became confused and restless. "I must be imagining things," I thought. But then, the morgue lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped significantly. Dr. Matthews looked around, and something about the room seemed different. The air was heavy, almost as if the room itself was contracting. He looked at the young woman's body again and saw something that made him freeze in fear. Her eyes, which had previously been closed, were now open. She was staring. "That's not possible," Matthews said out loud, trying to rationalize what he was selling. But the young woman's cold, empty gaze remained fixed on him. Then, without warning, the body began to slowly move, rising from the autopsy table. Matthews backed away, dropping instruments to the floor, the sound echoing through the empty morgue. Before you could react, a young man whispered something in a language he didn't recognize. The voice was faint, but it seemed to be sent from a dark energy. Then, just as it appeared, the body fell back onto the table, inert. Matthews ran to the door, feeling panic gripping his mind. He had never experienced anything so terrifying in all his years in the profession. That night, he left the hospital without looking back, swearing that he would never perform another autopsy in that cursed place again. Did you like this story? Do you have something incredible to share? If you or someone you know has had a hair-raising experience in traffic, whether as a driver or passenger, send your story. Who knows, it might appear in our next video. Send your report in the comments or by email, and let's explore the mysteries of the road together.